One new feature you've probably already noticed is our camera post-production, which automatically comes up after every render. So I'm going to go ahead and do a quick render right now, just of one of the default scenes of the basic sky, and automatically our post-render options come up. Now we can click to show this dialog when render completes on or off. By default it's on, but if you don't want this popping up every single time you do a render, you can go ahead and turn that off. But we also have a couple of new features in here, which is our natural film response. I'm going to go ahead and turn that off right now, and you can see that the color of our scene is much brighter and it's much more saturated and not as realistic looking. But once we turn that on, we can see that we have a more realistic looking scene. So we can already tell the difference between a view 5 scene and a view 6 scene. And now this looks even better when we have a spectral atmosphere. So let's go ahead and load one of those in. And I'm just going to load in one of the asileFX collection atmospheres that we have. Just something to give us a good idea of how this is going to look. We'll just let that load in there. And we'll want to adjust our camera so that we can see it a little bit better. And now I'm going to go up and just do a final render using render to screen, and we'll just go ahead and render that and wait for our camera post to show up. Okay, now our frame is rendered, and let's take a look at the difference between the natural film response off and on with the spectral atmosphere. With it off, you notice that we have some very, very bright spots in our atmosphere, and with the natural film response, it sort of blends it overall. So you can either turn this on or off. I prefer it on. I think the scenes look a lot better that way. We don't get these over-contrasted areas, and of course it's much more realistic, and it is more of a natural film response. It does look more like it was filmed with a camera and not CG. So there's a big difference between the two, and you'll just have to see which is your preferred preference, whether you'd want it on or off. By default, it is automatically on, and you will see a big difference in different skies, different scenes by using the natural film response. So it's a very cool new tool in View 6. And now I'm going to go ahead and just close this out, and I'm actually going to get a little bit of a broader scope here of our scene and do a little bit larger render to show you another one of the features in the post-production. So I'm going to go ahead and just render this really quick and wait for our post to come up. Right underneath natural film response is our auto exposure, and we also have the ability to adjust our manual exposure. Let's go ahead and take a look at auto exposure, and we can see that what it does is it actually brightens up the scene over here. I'm going to check off that natural film response too, and we can see the difference between that as well. We get much more blending with it on. You can see by auto exposing the scene, we have our whiters are whiter and our blacks are a little bit blacker. And if we check off auto exposure, we can also adjust that exposure with this little slider right here to get exactly what sort of effect we're looking for. Another really cool thing is the lens glare, which allows us to adjust our lens flares that we have in the scene. Of course, right now I don't have any, so I'm going to go ahead and close this out and put a lens flare into the scene. And we are just going to enable a lens flare. Just a default should be fine. Just something that shows up in the scene that we can edit with in that post. So I'm going to go ahead and render this frame again. Okay, so now we can see the lens flare on the screen. I'm also going to note that I do have fade in fog and fade behind objects off, so that way we can see this lens flare through the clouds. But let's go ahead and take a look. What we can do is actually adjust our radius of that lens flare in post-production, which is really cool, and then the amount of it as well. So if you're going to be using lens flares and you want to be able to have a little bit more control over them, post-processing within View 6 is just phenomenal. So we can go in there and do a lot of these post-production changes that we'd normally have to do elsewhere, or we'd have to set up in the actual scene itself. And sometimes it's just much easier to do it in post-production than it is to actually change the scene.